The Young and the Restless spoilers Saturday's full episode September 13th, 2025. Nick Newman had always been a man caught between loyalty and desire, a figure torn by the weight of his family's legacy and the complexity of his own choices. On a quiet evening in Genoa City, he found himself confiding once again in Sharon, the woman who had always been a constant in his life. The storm of the Newman name, the battles waged by Victor, and the chaos surrounding his siblings weighed heavily on him, and Sharon's presence gave him a rare reprieve. Sitting across from her, Nick admitted how suffocating it felt to always be tethered to his father's expectations, how the looming shadow of Victor Newman dictated every move they made. Sharon, ever the voice of reason, listened intently, offering him the calm he needed to voice the thoughts he dared not share with anyone else. Yet beneath their quiet exchange lingered an undeniable truth. No matter how far Nick tried to distance himself from his family's schemes, he was always pulled back in, bound by blood and loyalty, trapped in the endless cycle of Newman drama. Elsewhere in Genoa City, Jack Abbott sat with Billy, a heavy weight pressing against his chest as he looked into his brother's troubled eyes. Jack had spent decades trying to steady the Abbott legacy, to keep Jabbit alive through storms of betrayal and corporate wars, but in this moment, all of that seemed to fade away. He confessed to Billy that he felt utterly alone, that despite the empire and the family name, his life had dwindled into solitude. The ache of having no partner to share his burdens with gnawed at him, the emptiness seeping into his words as he admitted that companionship had eluded him despite all his efforts. Billy, reckless and unpredictable as ever, offered little comfort beyond his restless ambition, his mind already turning toward battles that Jack did not want to fight. Yet Jack's vulnerability exposed the cracks beneath the surface. The mighty Abbott patriarch was not invincible, and his loneliness was beginning to consume him. In another corner of the city, Kane Ashby leaned closer to Phyllis Summers, his voice dripping with confidence as he painted a bold picture of the future. The chaos in Genoa City, the constant feuds between families, the unstable balance of power, he saw it all as opportunity. He told Phyllis, with an almost sinister certainty, that soon the two of them would be running the city. For Kane, manipulation was an art form, and he believed he had the pieces aligned to seize control. Phyllis, fiery and unpredictable, listened with a mixture of intrigue and suspicion. She had always been drawn to schemes, to the thrill of power plays, but even she knew that aligning with Kane meant stepping into dangerous territory. Still, the possibility of carving out influence beyond Victor and the Newmans was too tantalizing to dismiss outright. Their whispered conversation carried the weight of conspiracy, a quiet declaration that they were ready to play a game that could upend Genoa City itself. At the same time, Sally Spectra found herself cornered by the fallout of Kane's ruthless maneuvering. The story had broken, the press was running with Kane's leaks, and the empire she had fought tooth and nail to build now teetered on the edge of collapse. She was livid, her emotions raw, her fury spilling over as she turned on Billy in their shared apartment. Her voice trembled with rage as she shouted that everything she had worked for had been reduced to ashes because of Kane's games. She demanded to know why she should take the blame, why she should carry the weight of the scandal when it was Kane's betrayal that set the fire ablaze. The betrayal cut deeply. She had built herself up from nothing, clawed her way into relevance, only to be dragged back into chaos by a man she never should have trusted. Her anger was volcanic, her passion unstoppable, and she laid it all bare before Billy. Billy, however, did not respond with equal rage. Instead, his eyes flickered with a dangerous glint, the spark of ambition that had always driven him into reckless choices. He suggested, almost casually, that perhaps Kane could still be useful. What if they played into his schemes rather than resisting them? What if they let him hand them the keys to the kingdom and then used that opening to bring down Victor Newman once and for all? Billy's voice grew darker as he painted the scenario, imagining the moment when he could seize Chancellor, when he could prove to Victor that he had finally outmaneuvered the legendary Titan. It was not just about power for Billy, it was about vindication. about proving that he was more than Victor's perpetual disappointment. For him, the scandal was not an end, but a doorway into opportunity. Sally recoiled at the idea, her instincts screaming that Kane was a threat, not an ally. She told Billy firmly that Kane was using them as pawns, that his every move was designed to turn them into scapegoats while he walked away clean. She refused to be anyone's sacrificial lamb. Not now, not ever. The tension between them crackled like fire, Sally clinging to self-preservation while Billy chased glory. Their conflict reached a boiling point just as a sharp knock echoed through the apartment. Billy, annoyed but curious, opened the door to find Jack standing there, his eyes heavy with suspicion. Jack demanded to know what in the world was going on, his voice filled with frustration at the secrecy and the chaos that seemed to swirl around his brother yet again. Billy, ever the skilled liar, forced a smile and told Jack they had postponed the launch, that they were simply looking for a better path forward. His words were smooth, calculated, meant to shield Jack from the storm that truly brewed inside. But Jack was not convinced. He could see the flicker of guilt in Billy's eyes, the shadows lurking behind Sally's tense expression. Something darker was at play, and Jack knew it. The tangled web of ambition, betrayal, and desperation tightened around them all. Nick sought comfort in Sharon as his family's empire threatened to consume him. Jack revealed his vulnerability, quietly confessing to Billy that loneliness was breaking him apart. Kane whispered promises of dominance to Phyllis, weaving her into his dangerous vision. Sally, furious and betrayed, clashed with Billy as their future hung by a thread, while Billy's obsession with outmaneuvering Victor drove him deeper into risk. And Jack's arrival at the apartment hinted that the Abbott patriarch would not stay on the sidelines for long. Each move carried consequences, each secret threatened to explode, and Genoa City braced for another storm that could unravel everything its families had built. Jack arrived with the brittle calm of a man who had been pushed past patience and found only resignation on the other side, studied Billy and Sally for one suspended heartbeat, and decided, with a grim twist of his mouth, that they looked like full-costumed fools at Thaffelf masked by a cover story that was already unraveling. He sensed a performance in progress, a hastily assembled disguise draped over a disaster, and the realization that the product launch had been blocked without his knowledge turned confusion into cold alarm. Billy started to paper over the crater with the kind of easy lie that had carried him through a lifetime of near misses Postman for strategic reasons, a course correction, a smarter path, but the fawade cracked when Sally stepped forward and cut the fiction off at the knees. She would not share ownership of a lie that could metastasize into liability. She told Jack, in clipped, controlled sentences, that neither she nor Billy had pulled the plug, that they were just as blindsided as he was. The truth, which never waits politely to be invited, spilled into the room. The block came from outside, and they were standing in the fallout, trying to breathe. When Jack demanded to know who pressed the kill switch, Sally gave him the name. Without ornament, Canine added that he had dropped a replacement option on their doorstep that read like a dare. Half-baked, legally reckless, reputationally radioactive. Designed less to launch a product than to set fire to the people standing closest to it. Billy asked for time, as if time were a solvent strong enough to dissolve sabotage. Who had seen what delays become in Genoa City a labyrinth that eats career set an ultimatum with a steady voice? He had until morning to choose transparency and protection, or she would excise herself from a plan that had already started to use her as kindling. Then she left, not in anger exactly, but with the unmistakable efficiency of someone refusing to be the next headline. The door closed behind her, and the silence that replaced her was the silence of obligation arriving to collect. Jack did not raise his voice, because he no longer needed volume to convey disappointment. He simply told his brother that an explanation was owed, then waited while Billy's temper tried to alchemize humiliation into control. But rage is poor currency in a room that runs on ledgers, and Billy blinked first, snapping that if Jack wanted to cut the funding, he should do it and do it now. Jack did not flinch. He explained, with the businesslike finality of a term sheet, that the entity he had bankrolled was always a bridgenet, a home, and the bridge had served its purpose. He would be pulling his money back across the water before the far shore slid into quicksand. He called Chancellor Billy's latest addiction with a clarity that carried no malice and all the weight of history. Another high, another chase, another promise to get clean once the rush subsided. And then he stepped out, wishing Billy luck the way you wish a gambler luck at a table the house owns, leaving behind a brother and a mess and a room overfull with unfinished explanations. Left alone with adrenaline and the faint chemical sting of burnt capital, Billy sat and replayed the last month in ruthless detail. How the Chancellor talk had started as a temporary alignment and become a creed. How the AI launch had been framed as an elegant proof that he could out-organize the Newmans, out-innovate the Abbotts, and out-risk the market. How Victor's shadow had lengthened the closer he got to daylight. The memory resolved into a single conviction, the old one that always felt new in the moment. Victor Newman had underestimated him for the last time. He would take the blow that Kane had aimed at his midsection, roll with it, and rise inside Victor's guard. He would set terms, not absorb them. He would turn the blocked launch into a case study in tactical patience and stagecraft, use the night to unspool the wiring behind Kane's alternative. And by morning, he would have data, not fair paper trails, not hunches, names, not rumors. If Kane had turned the press into a blast furnace, then Billy would redirect the exhaust toward the saboteur. The mantra steadied him. If the launch was a battlefield, then diagnostics were reconnaissance. The first soldier over the wall should be a forensic accountant, not a brand manager. He sent 3 quiet texts: legal, compliance, systems for logs, access histories, calendar metadata. He would demand a DNA test from the chaos, and the result would be called proof. Across town, in a paneled room where decisions travel faster than minutes and reputations hang from invisible hooks, Phyllis turned to Kane with a look that mixed admiration at the audacity with disgust for the method. She had no allergy to risk. She simply liked her risk symmetrical. Why? She wanted to know. Had he thrown this entire jagged story into Billy and Sally's laps with such transparent force that even a disinterested observer could trace the arc back to his fingertips? Kane's answer was not a confession so much as a chess annotation. Let Billy neutralize Victor. Let the would-be knight charge the king, while the bishop and the rook remain in the long grass. It was not cowardice, he insisted, but architecture. Let public attention follow the flash. Let regulators tug at the thread attached to names that welcomed cameras. Then, when the board is ray-tiled by panic, move on straight lines no one is watching. Phyllis knew a shell game when she saw one, and she also knew how often the shell game ends with the operator outpacing the audience. But she also knew that Kane had never been more dangerous than when he believed the map in his head perfectly described the territory under his feet. The leak to the press softened it into proactive narrative management, was the kind of move that created enemies you could count and liabilities you could not. Still, he held the room with the confidence of a man who had already rehearsed the next 3 news cycles and had a statement prepared for each of them. Sally returned to the council with the sharp and calm of someone who had spent the last hour watching the future rearrange itself. She did not posture. She brought receipts. She told Kane as cleanly as she had told Jack that Billy would not be walking the road laid out for him like a trap, that if this scheme relied on a scapegoat, it would have to find a different volunteer, that replacement plan was a term of art here for tying a career to a time bomb and calling it a wristwatch. Kane did not bristle. He evangelized. Billy needed a win, he said, and the need for a win is an engine that burns through caution by design. Sally countered that using a man's hunger as an accelerant was not strategy, but predation. She laid out the web of consequences with the cool specificity of an operations brief. A blocked launch pulsing on social media, reporters fishing for a villain, regulators who had learned to aim their first questions at the names in the press release, investors who remember the last crisis more vividly than the last quarter. She outlined how Kane's alternative left those names exposed and his own paper trail obfuscated, how the architecture of the pivot created a neat funnel for blame, and she signaled with a threat, only precision that she had already preserved the artifacts that proved it. He called it paranoia. She called it chain of custody. Elsewhere, the air around Newman Enterprises carried the crackle of weather about to break. Victor's apparatus did not panic. It recalibrated. Legal drafted without adjectives. Public affairs pre-wrote the questions they preferred to be asked. The board's independent members exchanged layered emails about prudence and contingency and the circumstances under which silence becomes a posture rather than a void. There was a version of this story, one the family had lived so often it no longer needed color commentary, in which Victor treated the entire episode as a teaching opportunity and Billy as a case study, then moved a single piece on the chessboard that made the antagonist discover he had been working on an inside-out puzzle the whole time. That version was already humming through the halls, a low electrical inevitability. But unpredictability lived in the seams. Chancellor's co-founders calculating risk exposure, a handful of engineers wondering whether their branch protections had been altered before the block, a vendor to time zones away, realizing their integration window had been mirrored without authorization. If the house always wins, it still has to keep the cameras on. Nick, who had been confiding in Sharon only hours before about his exhaustion with the gravitational pull of his surname, found himself tracing the latest turbulence right back to the usual celestial body. He had tried to refuse cynicism, it kept refusing him back. He reached out to Sally, not with a savior's impulse, but with the practical reflex of someone who understood how fast narratives gel and how hard they are to dissolve once they do. He offered her the two things she could use: a media telespace to breathe and a pair of eyes unconnected to the caper. Sharon, hearing the shape of the problem without needing the names, pointed out the old truth that every Genoa City scandal has a center and an edge, and survival depends on knowing which one you are being pushed toward. Sally already knew. The center burns longer, the edge falls faster. Either way, you get scars. Jack drove through the blue-black hour before dawn thinking about capital like a father thinks about grown children. What you pour in, what you get back, and the ways you keep loving the parts that do not love you back in return. He would not abandon Billy, but he would stop underwriting his gravity. The impulse to call Victor and warn him that Kane's game was about to use the Newman furnace for heat flickered and went out. The two families communicate enough by action. Instead, he drafted a quiet memo to partition Jabbat from ambient combustion and made a second note to have finance build an exposure tree that assumed worst-case cross-contamination. He would give Billy a day to choose: information over impulse, architecture over appetite. He would not hold his breath. Kyle, preoccupied, could not be the counterweight Jack needed him to be right now. And the absence was another kind of pressurion, more reminder that leadership is a synonym for carrying things no one sees. While the city slept like a body between convulsions, Billy mapped and tested. The logs came back with 3 red flags disguised as green lights. Permissions cleaned up after the block as if curated. A scheduling artifact suggesting the kill had been queued from a machine that belonged to no one and everyone. And a metadata echo inside the replacement plan document that tagged a draft author whose name did not appear anywhere near the project charter. It was exquisite craftsmanship, because the point of a frame is not to imitate handwriting, but to place the pen in a hand the audience is already predisposed to blame. He built a timeline on a whiteboard and then erased it, not out of frustration, but because the exercise proved the wrong truth, that he could reconstruct the choreography of the sabotage, but not yet the locksmith who cut the keys. He needed leverage before he confronted Kane, not theories. Leverage that made the next move automatic in a scroll of consequences, ready to release if the saboteur reached for the wrong lever. The idea that arrived was less elegant than effective. Seed a decoy vector into the calms that only Kane would touch if he wanted to accelerate the story, then watch which reporter called first. Not perfect, Not pretty, but the math was clean. Kane, for his part, did not sleep at all. He curated a version of events for each audience he would address after sunrise and practiced them like a man polishing mirrors. One for investors that spoke of resilient roadmaps. One for partners that bled contrition without admitting anything that could be footnoted in a courtroom. One for the press that used verbs that sound like accountability while meaning choreography. He checked on Phyllis, found her awake and ambivalent, and tuned his pitch according livition, laced with inevitability, assurance flavored with exclusivity. She had questions about the blast radius if the regulator attention he was inviting refused to leave on schedule. And he answered by reminding her that the city's attention span is shorter than its memory and both can be managed. He spoke the word soon like a promise. Phyllis filed the tone away. Promises are often timestamps disguised as comfort. She had survived too many cycles to confuse a forecast with a guarantee. If Kane's plan worked, she could ride the lift. If it collapsed, she wanted enough distance to deny she ever touched the scaffolding. Sally did not pay spacing is a ritual for the powerless. She codified. She assembled a package that itemized the replacement proposal's structural faults in project language instead of outrage. She appended screenshots of permission diffs and a call tree that showed just how carefully the last-minute changes had been advertised to the wrong people and concealed from the right ones. She drafted a letter addressed to counsel rather than to the court of public opinion and deposited both in places that would outlive anyone's narrative. She was done being the match. If Billy decided to be the spark anyway, she could not stop him, but she would not stand close enough to catch. The text she sent him before dawn was the kind that ends an arrow without melodrama. Choose guardrails or choose velocity, but stop pretending both are available at the same speed. Morning did not bring clarity so much as thresholds. Billy met Sally with the wired calm of a man who had chosen a vector and burned the other bridges in his mind. He told her, with more steadiness than she expected, that Kane would get a meeting bit, not the one he thought. Billy would hear him out long enough to confirm which trap he planned to spring, and then show him the piece of bait he had already poisoned. If Kane wanted to move through third parties, they would move through a third party that talked back. If he wanted to write the press would write him first with questions only the saboteur would recognize as answers. Sally studied him for a long, unsparing beat and saw both the talent and the flaw. The talent for improvisation. The flaw of believing that because he could surf a wave, he could also predict the ocean. She told him, without ceremony, that if his line snapped she would not be the rope. He nodded, not in agreement so much as an acknowledgement of jurisdiction. There are kinds of love that look like loyalty. There are kinds of loyalty that look like rescue. She owed him neither. At the council, the choreography accelerated. Phyllis opened with the wrong question on purpose to see who would rush to correct it. Kane obliged with a correction styled as magnanimity and moved straight into the sermon. Billy needs a win. The city craves an underdog. Victor has become the weather, and people love a man who can make a hole in the clouds. Sally arrived mid-aria and absorbed a minute of it before cutting into announce, with the clean sobriety of a doctor signing a discharge, that Billy would not be following a script that did not list the author on the title page. Kane did not argue the premise. He argued the inevitability. The house is never defeated outright, only tired, and Billy had the endurance of a man with something to prove to an audience he has already imagined forgiving him. She reminded him that casinos do not get lighter when you empty your pockets onto the table. He smiled like a man already counting someone else's money. Victor received the first whisper before breakfast and did not alter his routine. He skimmed the outline, annotated it once in the margin 3 short words that might as well have been a weather report, and handed it back to be absorbed into the machinery that keeps a dynasty from confusing vigilance with paranoia. He did not have to say the phrase everyone else was thinking, the one Billy had already thrown over his shoulder in the dark like a toast. The house always wins. What Victor understood and his antagonists kept forgetting is that the house is not a room or a license or even a family. It is a discipline. It counts before it speaks. It measures before it moves. It stores each challenge under glass and studies it until new patterns emerge. If Kane believed he could use Billy as an instrument to scuff Victor's crown, then Victor would allow the music to play long enough to identify the conductor. If Billy believed he could turn the sabotage inside out and make a victory out of the wreckage, then Victor would let him run until the yard lines rearranged into a cage. Either way, the math finished where it always does, with the person who confuses momentum for leverage discovering just how heavy leverage actually is. Back in the small, airless room, where Billy had first decided to become the kind of man who survives by inventing exits, he waited for Kane with two versions of the future queued up and labeled. In one, he allowed himself the sugar high of vengeance, rode the narrative, and prayed the floor would hold. In the other, he gave the data its turn at the microphone, made the case, and kept the heat where it belonged. When Kane walked in with the grin of a man delighted to see his forecast verified by the weather, Billy smiled back with a composure that did not read like surrender and did not read like war. It read like a professional who has finally learned that proof is quieter than pride. Somewhere between those two silences, a phone rang in a newsroom with a question that only the architect of the block could answer correctly. Somewhere miles away, a permissions log cloned itself into a folder Billy did not know he owned yesterday. Somewhere above them both, Jack finished signing a memo that turned potential splash damage into mist. And across town, Sally closed a laptop on which she had written the kind of documentation that keeps the future from rewriting the past. By nightfall, nothing had exploded and everything had changed. Billy still told himself he was coming for Victor because he could not yet imagine a life that did not require a mountain to justify the climb. Jack still loved a brother who mistakes audacity for oxygen. Sally still refused to be anyone's accelerant. Phyllis still weighed proximity against plausible deniability with a jeweler's eye. And Kane still believed that the line between orchestration and control is thin enough to cross without leaving footprints. Genoa City, which thrives on the difference between spectacle and consequence, tilted to listen for the sound of a shoe that might never drop. The launch had been blocked. Yes, the plan had been replaced, allegedly. The press had been fed, absolutely. But the question that mattered more than every headline was the one that kept the city's most dangerous players awake even when they were sleeping. Who got to decide when the story ended? And what was the price of being wrong about that answer?